This freedom is the essence of individuation, the alchemical process of turning your suffering into wisdom, your fragmentation into wholeness, and your inner exile into homecoming. So if you find yourself still stuck, remember this: you are not broken. You are becoming. And the most profound healing happens not in escaping your story, but in embracing it, fully, fiercely, and tenderly, until you finally know that every part of you, even the parts you once hid away, belong to the sacred mosaic of your true self. This is your journey, your shadow, your light, your whole. And it is enough. True healing demands the dismantling of illusions. The illusion that progress is always forward, that pain can be avoided, that knowing is enough, or that you can escape the depths of your own soul. It asks you to let go of identities that no longer serve you, to relinquish control, and to meet your inner child with tenderness and unwavering presence. It asks you to interrupt the patterns of repetition compulsion, to recognize when you are performing your healing for others instead of truly doing it for yourself, and to see the ego's resistance as a guardian of your survival, not your prison. This is not easy. It is not quick. It requires humility, patience, and radical self-compassion. It requires embracing the paradox that you are already whole even as you are still becoming. Because healing is not about becoming someone new, it is about remembering who you were all along, beneath the layers of fear, defense, and survival. When you choose to stay present with your pain and your light, your shadow and your spirit, you step into a deeper freedom, one that no external achievement can grant. That is the work. That is the truth. And that is where your liberation begins. Healing is not a destination. It is not a checklist of inner work completed or milestones reached. It is a lifelong dance, a sacred, often painful unfolding with yourself. Carl Jung taught us that the journey toward wholeness demands a courage that many overlook. The courage to stay in the unknown, to stay with the discomfort, to stay present in your own becoming without rushing toward false endings or illusions of progress. You may have spent years excavating your shadow, analyzing your wounds, chasing insights, and practicing rituals. Yet, if you still feel stuck, it is because healing is not a linear arc or a final achievement. It is the willingness to be here, fully human, fully flawed, fully vulnerable. The willingness to welcome the darkness without fleeing, to integrate the fractured parts of your psyche rather than suppress them, and to embody the messy, beautiful paradox of being both wounded and whole. Especially when it hurts, because pain, when held with love, becomes initiation, and every part of you longs not to be erased, but to be remembered. So if you're still stuck, even after all the work, it may be because you're still searching for escape, still hoping healing will erase your pain instead of teaching you how to live with it. But pain doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're alive. And integration is about learning to carry that aliveness with grace, even when it burns. Jung's work reminds us that the shadow is not an obstacle to healing. It is the gateway to wholeness. You do not become whole by exiling the parts that make you uncomfortable. You become whole by bringing them home, sitting in silence with your sorrow, holding your shame without flinching, letting the wound stay open long enough for it to speak, not be silenced. Because healing is not escape, it is embodiment. It is choosing to return again and again to the parts of you that you once abandoned, and offering them your presence, not your judgment. When you stop trying to escape your humanity, you begin to enter your divinity, not as something separate, but as something found through your wounds. Because the divine doesn't live above your suffering, it lives inside it, waiting to be seen, felt, held, and welcomed home. Integration also means letting go of the fantasy of arrival. There is no final version of you waiting at the end of this work. No ideal self who no longer hurts, doubts, or struggles. That fantasy is another trap, another escape. The soul doesn't evolve by climbing a ladder. It deepens by spiraling inward, layer by layer, into greater authenticity. Integration asks, can you hold your complexity without judgment? Can you stop trying to graduate from your pain and instead relate to it with presence? The goal is not to become some perfected version of yourself, it's to become more real, more rooted, more alive. Healing, then, is not the path out of suffering, but the path through it. And integration is the art of walking that path with open eyes and an open heart, even when it hurts. Carl Jung said, "Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries." That means bringing all of you to the table, the wise one and the wounded one, the lover and the saboteur, the part of you that prays and the part of you that screams. Integration doesn't mean you never break again. It means you no longer pretend you're not already broken in sacred, necessary ways. The obsession with fixing ourselves often blinds us to what healing truly requires. Not more effort, but deeper acceptance. Not more tools, but more tenderness. You can't escape your pain by becoming more spiritual, more intellectual, or more productive. You can only integrate it by inviting it into the room, sitting with it, listening, offering it a seat at the table of your awareness without trying to change it. That's what the soul longs for, not perfection, but permission. Permission to be fractured and still be loved. Permission to feel rage and still be worthy. Permission to carry grief like a river and not be told to dam it. Not into intimacy, not into joy, not into the wholeness you're craving. You must peel it off like dead skin. You must walk naked into the wilderness of the self, unarmed and undefended. And there, in that raw, uncertain space, you will begin to hear your true voice again. Faint at first, then louder, then undeniable. And this voice will not flatter you. It will not promise safety, but it will tell the truth. And it will remind you, you were never meant to be someone else's version of you. You were meant to be free. And that freedom begins when the false self ends. So much of what we call healing is really a disguised attempt to escape. Escape discomfort, escape pain, escape the messiness of being human. You try to ascend, detach, vibrate higher. You seek to become untouchable, calm, always in control. But real healing doesn't make you invulnerable. It makes you honest, and honesty is messy. Healing isn't about transcending the shadow, it's about integrating it, about making space in your psyche for contradiction, conflict, and chaos without losing your center. Accusations, withdrawal, and your ego will panic. See, we were right to stay hidden. But this is the crucible of transformation. The moment where you must decide, will I betray myself to keep this identity alive, or will I endure the discomfort of becoming someone truer? Jung's individuation process isn't about creating a better self. It's about uncovering the original self buried under all the adaptations. And to do that, you must let the old self crumble. You must weep for it, rage for it, honor it, and then release it. Because the longer you cling to a version of yourself that was born from survival, the longer you delay the emergence of the one born from freedom. So if you feel stuck, ask not what else you need to become, but what you're still afraid to stop being. Who are you when you're not performing your worth? Who are you without the role, the label, the strategy? This is the sacred unknown, the place where the ego dies and the soul rises. But you cannot take the old identity with you. If you stop being the helper, who will need you? If you stop being the high performer, who will admire you? If you stop being the one who's always healing, what will define you? These are not small questions, they are existential. Because identity isn't just personality, it's survival. It's your unconscious contract with the world. If I act this way, I'll be safe. If I stay in this role, I'll be loved. So when healing asks you to surrender that role, your entire nervous system may rebel. You might find yourself slipping back into old behaviors, not because you failed, but because your body still believes the old self is your only protection. This is why change often comes with grief, because it's not just about becoming new, it's about saying goodbye. The most painful part? Others might resist your evolution too. People were attached to the old you. They were comfortable with your mask, your compliance, your reliability and dysfunction. When you start saying no, when you start showing anger, when you stop being what they expect, you'll face friction. The identity you wore like armor. The version of you that knew how to earn love, how to be acceptable, how to keep things together when everything was falling apart. You had to become someone to survive. And it worked. It got you through. But now that version of you is standing between who you were and who you're becoming. And the truth is, healing won't fully land until you're ready to mourn that false self. The people pleaser, the overachiever, the savior, the victim, the good girl, the strong one. Whatever mask you mastered, it must be laid down. Not because it wasn't valuable, but because it's no longer true. Jung called this process the symbolic death, a dying of the ego identity. And this death doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens over and over, in every choice to let go of who you're not, so you can meet who you actually are. But letting go of identity is terrifying, not because you don't want to be free, but because your identity gave you a script, a sense of place in the world. What part of me believes I won't survive if I change too much? That fear is sacred. It deserves to be held, not shamed. But it must not be obeyed. Because the ego can't lead you to transformation. It wasn't built for transcendence. It was built for protection. And once protection becomes limitation, the soul begins to suffer. Real healing begins when you stop trying to fix yourself and start grieving who you've had to be. When you allow the old identity to die, not all at once, but piece by piece. When you stop defending your familiar suffering and begin risking unfamiliar joy. This is the moment Jung called the confrontation with the self, when the ego steps aside, trembling, and something deeper takes the reins. Not perfection, not enlightenment, but wholeness. And wholeness begins where the ego ends, on the other side of control, certainty, and the self you've outgrown. Healing requires grief, not just of lost relationships or past pain, but of yourself. Or rather, the self you once believed you had to be. Not in dramatic breakdowns, but in subtle resistance. You forget to meditate. You ghost a therapist. You scroll for hours. You over-intellectualize your feelings. You stay in relationships that reflect your old self, even when you know they shrink you. The ego doesn't stop you with chains. It stops you with distractions, with logic, with comfort, with stories like, "You're doing enough," or "It's not that bad," or "You've already healed this." But if you listen closely, beneath those rationalizations is fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of losing control, fear of becoming someone you don't yet recognize. That fear is not a flaw. It's a signal. It's the ego trying to keep you safe the only way it knows how, by keeping you the same. But sameness is not safety when your soul is trying to grow. It becomes a cage. And at some point, you must choose comfort or truth, familiar pain or unfamiliar freedom. If you still feel stuck after all your work, ask yourself, what part of me is afraid of what's next? He wrote, "Enlightenment is not imagining figures of light, but making the darkness conscious. And that darkness includes your ego's terror of change. You must not just heal your wounds, you must confront the part of you that benefits from keeping them alive. The ego's entire structure is built on identity. I am the strong one. I am the broken one. I am the achiever. I am the victim. These identities may hurt, but they are predictable. They provide a frame, a script, a sense of who you are. And real healing threatens to unravel that script, to take you into a space where there are no roles, no personas, no clear answers, just presence, just being. And that kind of spaciousness is terrifying to the ego, because if you are no longer your trauma, your title, your performance, then who are you? And that's the threshold where many people stop. Not because they don't want to heal, but because healing means surrendering the illusion of self the ego so carefully constructed. This is where the most sophisticated sabotage happens. One part of you longs to grow, to heal, to become, while another part clings to the familiar with white-knuckled fear. That second part is the ego. Not the boastful caricature people often mistake it for, but the ancient psychic structure tasked with keeping you safe. The ego is not evil, it's not your enemy, but it is terrified of annihilation. Because every true transformation demands the death of something the ego built to survive. And death to the ego is unacceptable. So when you approach the edges of real change, when you begin to question your identity, when you let go of a long-held belief, when you choose rest over productivity, vulnerability over performance, the ego panics. It whispers, "This is dangerous. This is unfamiliar. This is not who we are." And in that moment, without realizing it, you pull back. You self-sabotage. You hesitate. Not because you're weak, but because the ego equates change with death, and it will protect itself at all costs. Carl Jung understood this paradox intimately. So if you feel stuck, even though you've built a convincing image of healing, ask yourself this: who are you when no one is watching? Can you sit with your shame without turning it into a story? Can you weep without turning it into wisdom? Can you be messy, unfiltered, unresolved, and still feel worthy of love? Because that's what real healing asks of you. To drop the identity. To let go of the polished mask, even the spiritual one. To stop chasing wholeness as an aesthetic and start honoring it as a living, breathing, chaotic process. You don't need to be impressive. You don't need to be wise. You just need to be true. Wholeness isn't a look. It's a relationship with your contradictions, with your shadows, with your humanity. And that kind of healing doesn't always look good, but it feels like freedom. And freedom isn't pretty, it's real. And you were never meant to be a brand. You were meant to be a soul, alive, changing, and deeply, unapologetically human. There is a quiet war inside you. And your soul will know the difference, even if no one else does. This is why many people who appear deeply healed still feel hollow inside. They've constructed an image of themselves so convincing that even they believe it. But the body doesn't lie. The body remembers the emotions that were skipped, the truths that were never spoken, the pain that was polished instead of processed. And over time, that gap between image and essence becomes unbearable. You become exhausted. Not from the healing itself, but from the performance of healing. You feel disconnected, not because you haven't grown, but because you're no longer sure who is growing, you or the version of you the world has come to admire. Jung's concept of individuation isn't about becoming more likable, more successful, or more spiritually evolved. It's about becoming more yourself, especially the parts that won't win applause. Especially the parts that can't be posted or performed. Especially the parts that are still raw, unsure, in process. And spiritualized personas are some of the most convincing prisons of all. In a culture obsessed with image, even inner work becomes branding. You construct your woke identity, your trauma-informed voice, your nervous system-aware lifestyle, your curated vulnerability. You share the breakdowns, but only once they've been processed enough to be palatable. You admit your flaws, but only the ones that make you seem brave. And slowly, your healing becomes less about becoming and more about appearing. This is not conscious manipulation, it's survival. You've simply learned, once again, to perform safety. But true healing isn't safe. It's disruptive. It threatens the very persona you've built, because real wholeness doesn't care if it's beautiful. It cares if it's honest. It includes the days when you regress, the moments when your triggers still rule you, the nights when you collapse into old patterns. And if you can't bring those parts into your healing, then your healing is aesthetic, not authentic. It's time to draw a new one, not by erasing the past, but by choosing, consciously in the present, to no longer be defined by it. There's a subtle but dangerous shift that can happen along the healing path, one that is almost invisible because it's wrapped in virtue. You begin your journey seeking authenticity, relief, reconnection. But somewhere along the way, the process becomes performance. You start healing not to be whole, but to look whole. You start curating your identity as the healed one, the self-aware one, the wise one who's done the work. And before you know it, healing becomes your new persona. It's polished, admirable, admired. You say the right things, you quote the right thinkers, you express emotional insight with eloquence. But beneath that performance lives a part of you that still feels like a fraud, that still feels unseen, unheld, unfree. Because you didn't heal to be real, you healed to be liked. And that version of healing is just another mask. Jung warned us, the persona, when mistaken for the self, becomes the prison. Is this truth or just what I was told? That moment of pause, of disruption, is everything. It breaks the loop. It allows the past to be seen as past. But this takes immense courage, because to break the cycle, you must do something the wounded child never could. Walk away, set a boundary, choose differently. Feel the fear, and stay anyway. So if you keep finding yourself in the same emotional loops, don't ask what's wrong with you. Ask what your soul is still trying to resolve. Ask what story never got closure. What emotion never got expressed. What part of you is still trying to rewrite the same scene, hoping this time it ends with rescue, with love, with finally being chosen. But rescue won't come from repeating the wound. It comes from waking up inside it, from holding the trigger instead of letting it pull you, from seeing the pain for what it really is, not punishment, but pattern, not destiny, but echo. And echoes fade when you stop shouting into the same canyon. Repetition compulsion doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're trying to find your way home with a map drawn by a child. It craves familiarity. And what was familiar in childhood, neglect, chaos, silence, criticism, becomes the emotional landscape you unconsciously seek out in adulthood. You keep finding versions of your original caretakers in different people, not because you're doomed, but because you're still trying to win a game that was never fair to begin with. You're trying to master the pain by reliving it, hoping that this time it will end differently. The heartbreaking truth is this: as long as you're trying to fix the past through the present, you'll stay stuck. Because no one in the present can give you the childhood you never had. No partner can reparent you. No job can prove your worth. No friend can undo the loneliness you swallowed at age 7. These wounds must be witnessed, not repeated, felt, not reenacted. And the moment you recognize that the familiar pain is a memory trying to reinsert itself into your current reality, you reclaim your power. You can pause. You can ask, is this love? Or just what love used to feel like? You're not addicted to pain. You're trying to complete an unfinished story. You keep walking into familiar fires, hoping one day someone, maybe even you, will pull you out differently. But unless consciousness intervenes, you'll keep burning. Because the psyche doesn't seek comfort, it seeks completion. It seeks truth. And truth won't stop repeating itself until you're willing to meet it with something new. Awareness, boundaries, and above all, compassion. The child who wasn't seen grows into the adult who unconsciously finds lovers who don't look. The one who wasn't heard finds bosses who dismiss. The one who was blamed finds friendships that echo guilt. These aren't accidents, they're invitations, unconscious ones. Until we make the unconscious conscious, Jung taught, it will rule our lives and we will call it fate. You keep choosing familiar pain, not because you want to suffer, but because your nervous system recognizes it as home. It's tragic and deeply human. The nervous system doesn't crave happiness. Someone who stops abandoning themselves every time life gets hard. Because every time you override your emotions, silence your needs, or force yourself to keep going when your body says no, you reinforce the same wound. You tell that child, again, you don't matter. And until they believe they do, no amount of success, love, or external validation will make you feel whole. Reparenting is not glamorous. It's slow, repetitive, tender. But it is sacred work. Because when your inner child finally feels safe, you unlock the door to a self that was never broken, only hidden, waiting. There's a haunting pattern in the lives of those on the path of healing. No matter how much inner work they do, they keep encountering the same pain, the same dynamics, the same emotional betrayals, just dressed in different clothes. New partners, same abandonment. New job, same lack of worth. New friends, same rejection. This isn't coincidence. It's not failure. It's what Freud called repetition compulsion, and what Jung expanded into the realm of individuation, the soul's unconscious drive to repeat the original wound, not to suffer, but to heal it properly this time. Not how well you talk about your past, but how you respond when the old feelings arise. When the child cries, do you soothe or shame? When they're scared, do you listen or override? Most people unknowingly reenact emotional neglect by ignoring their internal signals. They bypass fear, numb grief, override exhaustion. But your body is your inner child's voice. That fatigue, that tightness, that lump in your throat, it's them, begging you to slow down and hear them, to protect them, not by defending your ego, but by softening, by allowing their needs to matter, not someday, now. If you still feel stuck, it may be because the part of you that suffered the most, the youngest, most fragile part, is still waiting to be chosen, not talked about, chosen. Your inner child doesn't need your analysis. They need your devotion. They need you to stop trying to become someone better and start becoming someone safer. Someone who doesn't punish themselves for being afraid. Someone who lets tears come without justification. But that's exactly what hurt them in the first place. Jung emphasized that what remains unconscious controls us. And the inner child is the ultimate unconscious driver. When they feel unseen, your adult life becomes a reenactment of their unmet needs. You'll chase emotionally unavailable people. You'll fear conflict like a threat to survival. You'll struggle to rest, to receive, to let go, because the child learned those things weren't safe. And no adult logic will change that. You cannot reason with a child who never felt safe. You must reparent them, with presence, with consistency, with love that is not performative but patient, love that doesn't try to fix but to hold. Sometimes we think we've healed because we've remembered the trauma, named the wound, confronted the parent. But memory is not healing. Healing happens in the now, when you change how you treat the child inside of you in real time. When you choose not to abandon yourself in the same way others did. That's the test. Not metaphorically, but neurologically, emotionally, psychologically. They are the part of you that formed when your nervous system first learned what it meant to be loved, or not. And if, in your earliest experiences, love was conditional, safety was unpredictable, or your needs were met with shame, that child learned to adapt, not to thrive, to survive. They learned to please, to disappear, to perform, to be perfect, or to never trust anyone fully. You might be 30, 40, 50 now, speaking fluent psychology. But when someone touches that old nerve, criticizes you, withdraws affection, shows disappointment, you regress. Not by choice, but by imprint. Because that child inside doesn't feel safe yet. And they don't care how much you know. They care how much you show up for them. The tragedy is that many of us try to heal the inner child with the same tools we use to suppress them. We silence their tears with affirmations. We shame their fear with high-vibe thinking. We push them aside because they are inconvenient, emotional, too much. That's where the work is, because the parts you've silenced are still shaping your life. They live in your muscles, your tone of voice, your emotional numbness, your inability to fully open in love. Emotional avoidance is not neutrality, it's imprisonment. And the cost is authenticity. Jung emphasized that healing requires integration of the shadow. But you cannot integrate what you refuse to feel. You cannot heal what you refuse to honor. This isn't about wallowing. It's about giving yourself permission to be human, messy, moody, furious, tender, wild. Until you allow those parts to breathe, they will continue to rule you from the dark. The way through is never bypass. The way through is in. Inward, downward, deeper, into the raw, wordless truth you've spent a lifetime trying not to touch. No matter how much healing work you've done, if your inner child doesn't feel safe, you will keep reverting to old patterns, especially under stress, intimacy, or fear of abandonment. That child lives inside you still. We say things like, "I should be over this by now," or "It's not that big of a deal," or "Other people had it worse." These are not just thoughts, they are betrayals. Small self-abandonments that accumulate over time, until one day you wake up and realize you no longer trust your own emotional truth. You've been taught to dismiss it, downplay it, spiritualize it. You've trained yourself to look calm on the surface while raging, aching, sobbing inside. But healing doesn't come from suppression. It comes from expression. Honest, messy, uncensored feeling. The kind of feeling that doesn't care about being polite, the kind that disrupts. And yet, that disruption is exactly where healing begins. The body knows. The tears you keep swallowing, the anger you've silenced, the terror you keep rationalizing, these are the doors. And they only open when you stop trying to be in control. If you still feel stuck despite all your efforts, look at what you haven't allowed yourself to feel. What have you labeled as too dramatic, too negative, not spiritual enough? Regulation, of course, is essential, but it becomes toxic when it becomes a shield against the deeper currents of our psyche. We're taught to aim for balance, for peace, for groundedness. But what if your soul doesn't want peace right now? What if your soul wants to scream? What if it wants to mourn everything you never allowed yourself to grieve? What if it wants to break down, to finally feel the weight you've carried since childhood? Emotional avoidance is not just about bypassing pain. It's about avoiding aliveness. Because real feeling isn't convenient. It's not linear. It doesn't fit neatly into a routine. It erupts, it derails, it humbles. And in our obsession with appearing healed, we often cut ourselves off from the very thing that would bring us back to life. To feel is to be vulnerable, and vulnerability threatens every structure the ego has built to stay safe. But without vulnerability, there is no intimacy, not with others, not with yourself. Avoidance also shows up in the subtle ways we gaslight ourselves. It's a return to breath, to ache, to truth, to yourself. One of the most deceptive traps on the healing journey is the quiet presence of emotional avoidance disguised as discipline, control, or even spirituality. You tell yourself you're doing the work, but you're really just trying to manage your emotions, not feel them. You meditate to silence your rage instead of hearing its message. You recite affirmations to override your grief rather than letting it wash through your chest like a storm. You focus on routines, books, journaling, techniques, all of which have their place, but deep down, you're terrified of what might happen if you stop doing and simply feel. Emotional avoidance is insidious because it often masquerades as maturity. You appear calm, regulated, composed. But that composure is often a shell, a defense, a way of keeping the chaos at bay so you don't have to touch what's raw and unhealed. Jung said, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. But modern healing culture often skips the pain and glorifies regulation instead. Jung understood this paradox. When the intellect becomes inflated, it distances us from the soul. And without soul, healing is just performance. Surface level, hollow. So if you're stuck, despite everything you know, it might be because you're still performing your pain instead of feeling it. You've turned healing into a role. You've mastered the language of transformation, but skipped its embodiment. And the soul cannot trick. It waits. Beneath your concepts and diagnoses, beneath your inner child affirmations and archetypal labels, it waits. For silence, for surrender, for the moment when you finally stop thinking and feel, when you finally break. Not because you're weak, but because something deeper is ready to be born. Insight is the doorway, but embodiment is the walk through the fire. And until you walk, you'll remain outside your own liberation, holding the map but never arriving. You don't need more knowledge. You need to trust what your body has always known, that healing isn't a concept. It requires going into the feeling itself, into the nausea, the grief, the rage that has no words, into the shaking body, the cold sweat, the chest that tightens when love gets too close. If you've intellectualized your pain, you've postponed the deeper work. You've narrated the wound, but you haven't yet entered it. This is why many people who have done all the work still feel empty. They have brilliant insights, can talk circles around their therapists, coach others with eloquence, but when life touches a raw nerve, they either shut down or explode. They haven't learned to sit with what they've so expertly named. They've replaced vulnerability with vocabulary, pain with performance, and worse, they've built identities around their healing. They wear their trauma like a badge of honor, a brand, a way to feel valuable in a world that rewards self-awareness but fears actual emotion. But self-awareness without self-compassion is just self-surveillance. You become your own warden, monitoring your every reaction, judging every misstep, never allowing your humanity to exist unpolished. This is the curse of the well-read wounded. You've built a fortress of knowledge around your heart, but a heart in a fortress cannot heal. It can only analyze its own suffering from a safe distance. And healing doesn't happen at a distance. It happens in the body, in the breath, in the tremble, in the tear you don't know how to cry. Carl Jung didn't call for more knowledge. He called for transformation. He warned against over-identifying with the intellect, because the intellect, while brilliant, is a defense mechanism too. It allows us to dissect pain without experiencing it. And often, we lean into intellect precisely because we are terrified of surrender, terrified of collapsing, terrified of what will surface if we stop understanding and just feel. So we stay in our heads, repeating stories of trauma like scripts, nodding in recognition at our own patterns while our inner child remains curled in the dark, untouched. Healing requires something far more terrifying than understanding. It requires embodiment. And living means risking exposure. It means allowing your darkness to breathe, not to dominate, but to be seen, honored, and slowly reintegrated. Not so you become perfect, but so you become real. The work is not done because the self is not static. The shadow lives as long as the ego fears vulnerability. So the question isn't, have you done the work? The question is, can you stay when the work gets quiet, invisible, and uncomfortable? There's a point in the healing journey where insight becomes a trap. You understand yourself so well, your patterns, your trauma responses, your attachment style, your shadow projections, that you start mistaking knowing for feeling. You can explain your wounds eloquently, break them down into theories, quote Jung and Gabor Mate with conviction. But when it comes to intimacy, when it comes to being fully seen, you still flinch. Because the pain lives in your body, not your mind. And no amount of intellectual clarity can substitute the raw, embodied process of emotional truth. It is catching the micro moment when you shrink yourself to be liked, the flicker of jealousy you try to intellectualize, the self-righteous anger you use to avoid grief. It's subtle, exhausting, and utterly necessary. Because every time you avoid these small truths, you strengthen the mask, and the longer you wear the mask, the more you forget there's someone underneath. Jung didn't call us to become enlightened beings. He called us to become whole, which means living with contradiction, holding paradox, loving what we were taught to despise. So, if you've done shadow work and you still feel stuck, good. That means you're still in it. You're no longer fooled by the spiritual bypassing that paints darkness as a low vibration to be cleansed. You understand that your shadow is not your enemy. It is your wounded protector. The part of you that learned to survive rejection, betrayal, abandonment by hiding. But now, your task is different. You're not surviving anymore. You're being asked to live. It means noticing how your spiritual language sometimes becomes a weapon to silence real emotion. It means recognizing when your healed self is just your persona in disguise. Well-spoken, emotionally literate, but still terrified of rejection, still desperate for control. The shadow doesn't go away. It becomes more subtle, more psychological. You no longer scream in rage, but maybe now you punish others through silence. You don't spiral into obvious self-destruction, but maybe you starve your joy, deny your needs, numb your body with productivity. The danger isn't in being wounded. The danger is in thinking you're above your wounds. Shadow work isn't about feeling better, it's about feeling truthfully. And that truth keeps unfolding. It keeps asking more of you. Are you still listening? The ego loves beginnings. It loves the high of revelation, the thrill of naming the monster in the dark. But it resists maintenance. It resists living with complexity. Shadow work is not the grand confrontation you have once. It is the quiet, daily choice to tell the truth when a lie would feel safer. When you let go of the need to constantly move forward, something deeper opens. The possibility of becoming someone real. Shadow work is not something you check off a spiritual to-do list. It's not a weekend retreat, a single breakthrough, or even a dozen therapy sessions. It's a lifelong confrontation with the parts of yourself you've exiled into silence. The parts you were told were too much, not enough, wrong, unlovable. These shadows don't disappear just because you've looked at them once. In fact, they often become more cunning. The moment you think you've integrated them, they shift form, moving from loud outbursts into subtle sabotage, from obvious projections into quiet self-betrayal. Jung warned that the shadow is not simply darkness. It is the unknown. And the unknown within us is always evolving. So to assume you've finished your shadow work is to mistake a glimpse for a map. You may have opened the door, but are you living with what you found? Real shadow work means staying in relationship with your darkness. And so, progress, ironically, becomes the very thing that blinds you to the next layer of your truth. Just because you've outgrown an old version of yourself doesn't mean you've met the one buried underneath. And this is the heartbreak of healing, the realization that there is no final version. Only deeper revelations, only layers, only cycles. And the more we resist this reality, the more we suffer at the hands of our own expectations. So if you're feeling stuck, it might not be a sign of failure. It might be a sign of arrival. You've reached the part of the journey where progress no longer looks like forward motion. It looks like stillness, like discomfort, like revisiting the same wound not to solve it, but to finally feel it. In Jungian psychology, this is the start of true individuation, when you stop trying to fix your humanity and start learning how to live with it consciously. The illusion of progress is seductive because it promises clarity. But wholeness is messy. It asks you to sit with contradictions, to hold both light and shadow without forcing resolution. What once felt like healing was often just a temporary relief, a pause in the storm. And yet we shame ourselves for going backwards. You think, but I already worked on this. But the wound says, not fully, not yet. Growth is not a straight line. It's a labyrinth, one where every dead end is a teacher. But in a culture obsessed with productivity and progress, even our healing becomes a performance. We start treating inner work like a to-do list. Inner child? Check. Shadow work? Check. Ancestral trauma? Check. But this approach is another mask, another way the ego clings to control. It wants to heal without being dismantled. It wants transformation without surrender. True inner work doesn't guarantee a life free of pain or confusion. In fact, the more aware you become, the more nuanced your suffering often becomes. The monsters you once fled now wear subtler disguises. Your perfectionism masquerades as spiritual discipline. Your need for control hides in your obsession with doing the work. To becoming whole, not perfect. Let's begin with one of the most seductive illusions of all, the illusion of progress. There's a kind of high that comes with self-development, a sense of movement, of evolution. You stack up breakthroughs like badges. You recognize old patterns, label your traumas, even trace behaviors back to childhood events. You feel wiser, stronger, more awake. But beneath that awareness often lies something far more unsettling, a quiet, persistent feeling that you're still stuck. That despite all the knowledge, something hasn't shifted where it really counts. The same triggers sting. The same emotional spirals pull you down. You keep reading, healing, reaching, and still your soul feels caged. This paradox is the trap of linear thinking. We've been taught to treat healing like a ladder, step by step, up and away from our pain. But the psyche doesn't unfold that way. Carl Jung taught that the psyche is circular, not linear. We spiral. We revisit the same wounds in deeper layers. You've read the books. You've sat in meditation. You've journaled, cried, gone to therapy, burned the sage, whispered mantras into the night like spells, trying to reach your unconscious. You've done the work. So why are you still stuck? Why do the same patterns keep repeating like echoes in a cave you can't seem to exit? Why, after all this effort, do you feel like you're moving in circles, wise enough to see the trap, but not free enough to escape it? The answer isn't that you're broken. It's that healing isn't what you think it is. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." And this is the crux of the matter. Most of us begin the journey not to meet our soul, but to fix a version of ourselves we've been taught is unworthy. But the soul cannot be fixed. It can only be remembered. This video isn't about blaming you. It's about unveiling the hidden reasons why your inner work hasn't led to liberation. Not yet. It's a map, not to transcendence, but to integration.